Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I hope you're able to see the slides. I see that we have a question already before we launch in from Jill about sending around notes and PowerPoint. I would say you don't have to write furiously and that you will get information from us. But, of course, if you just enjoy writing furiously, far be it from me to stop you.
No, we'll definitely be sending around the recording of this and your written reports as well, Anna.
Okay, great. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Hopefully what we're doing here today rings some bells and that you're aware of this big, ambitious project that ASRC has kindly taken on and sort of forward-thinkingly taken on behalf of the sector. And also, I'm suspecting, and I can see from the list of names that we have on, that many of you have actually already been willing and helpful participants in this research process. So this is a multi-phase research. Sorry, I'm just attempting to put in headphones and a little inelegantly. So this is a multi-phase research project in which we first examined the existing language. We then conducted a series of interviews, and we are quickly moving into rounds 3 and 4, which is testing. Today, what we're going to be talking about are the first 2 phases of work. So the first thing that we did here was a cognitive linguistic analysis. And what that basically means is digging under the ways that you all are currently communicating about asylum and refugee issues. The analysis consisted of 1,000 data points or unique constructions in language that help us sort of dig under what are people's perceptions, what are their assumptions, what are their beliefs about this issue. The sources of data in that sample included your own, many of you, some of the words you might even recognize. I'm kindly not using any sources in any quotations, but you can out yourselves if you feel like it. So advocacy and opposition, the ways that you all are speaking and writing and the way your opponents are. And then in addition, oh dear, someone is saying, I'm here. Okay, somebody's answering. I'm not going to attempt to answer tech questions because it's too distracting for me, but I trust that someone at ASRC will handle it. So social media and then also media depictions. In addition to that, as many of you know, we did 54 elicitation interviews with advocates in the field. What the cognitive linguistic analysis represents is what I like to call the you are here dot. This is the range of ways people currently reason and come to judgments. And what the interviews represent is the destination. This is what we wish people believe. This is how we wished that they reasoned. So let's look at some of what we unpacked. The purpose of this process is really to dig under the patterns of language to see the root of unconscious reasoning about these issues. And so I said earlier, a bit jokingly, that I am not going to name names when I give you quotations to show you examples of these patterns.
Joining the conference is...
That's not just in an attempt to be nice to you. Anybody who knows me knows that I make no attempt to be nice to anybody. It's really because if I'm pointing it out, it emerges as a larger pattern of speech. So it's common to many.
Joining the conference is
Amy Lemoyne.
Hey, Amy, we're just in the midst of it. So the first really noteworthy thing is a tendency, and here you are in very good company with pretty much all of progressive advocacy, to not name names and to skirt blame. So what this sounds like, for example, is the harm being inflicted on children detained is a direct result of Australia's actions. A man has been killed. Government policy is shaped by border protection concerns. The country may not be protected from human rights abuses. Asylum seeker arrivals have increased. Children have been needlessly placed. They have developed mental health disorders. These conditions drive. Countries have failed. Conditions didn't improve. Innocent people sat. 7 million refugees were found to be waiting, these injustices being perpetrated. So what you see from this pattern is that no one apparently does anything to anybody else. What happens with this kind of speech is that we know that people seek cognitive consistency. And basically, if we don't establish at the outset that a problem is person-made, then it is inconsistent for people to believe that it could be person-fixed. And so with all of these passive constructions, what we succeeded in doing is making it clear.
Joining the conference level, is name not recorded.
At an unconscious level, that bad things happen. And bad things happening is very, very sad, but it doesn't lead people to want or desire or sort of have top-of-mind human-made solutions. The next issue that we see emerging is an overwhelming tendency to reference the notion of problem. And of course, from our opponents, the notion of problem is situated very particularly in which, of course, the problem is people arriving. In our case, the problem is the policy, but what gets transmitted is that this is just a giant, huge mess of a nasty situation. And of course, we need to transmit. We want to transmit just how egregious these faults are. But at the same time, everyone in our audiences have 99 problems, and I can assure you they're not looking for yours. They are all set on problems, and they don't need any more. And so when we continue to reference this issue as this giant, complex, unresolvable, horrible dilemma, what it does is for our persuadable audiences who could be gotten on board with us. Yeah, someone's asking to mute. Yeah, if you all could put your phones on mute because we can hear the typing. Thank you. What discourse on all sides centering around the notion of problem just makes people want to basically watch the end of the world in high definition. It doesn't make them want to pay attention to you. We have to temper our expression of problem with the notion that this is actually something resolvable, something that we know how to do differently, and something that we actually have a solution to. There's a tendency also in the current language to reference detention via abstraction. And so we say things like offshore detention. We say things like offshore processing. We talk about the detention of minors. These kinds of phrases are comfortably devoid of horror, and they don't really make imageable the situations that we've created and are perpetuating. There's a tendency as well to speak in the language of problems and very, very infrequently to talk about solutions. In fact, if you just did a numerical count on how much of the language is in one vein or is describing one topic and another, solutions probably gets the least amount of text. But when we do start talking about how to resolve this, and more importantly about why we should resolve this, what we see is sort of a bifurcation of ideas. Some of the time, we see you all talking about the elimination of a bad, and sometimes, less frequently, we see you talking about the creation of a good. Now, whether it is better to talk about altering these policies and altering these procedures as eliminating a bad versus creating a good is an empirical question, and happily that's an empirical question that we're about to take up in the next rounds of research. But in the meantime, something that we do know from previous research and just from decades of study of cognition, one thing we don't want to be doing is toggling back and forth within the same sentence or closely thereafter between these two ideas. That this is that we need to do this because it's a way of getting rid of a bad thing or altering a bad thing, and that this is a way of creating a good thing. We sort of need to pick a lane and decide what's going to work. And that's what we'll be testing. When we're in the framework of elimination of a bad, there's a tendency to talk a lot about international law. So essentially kind of the argument line for why we should change this in the framework of we should stop doing a bad thing tends to tends to center around this notion of international obligations, honor responsibilities under international law, international human law, rights law requires, Australia is breaching international law, etc. Now, for this to work, one of three assumptions would have to be true. Either our audiences would have to believe implicitly that international law is a good thing, and therefore when we say we're not following international law or we should follow international law, they just get it. They're like, oh yeah, international law is good, and therefore that argument holds water with me because I recognize that as a good. So that could be one way that argument worked. A second way that argument could work would be if we were focusing on the idea of keeping your word. Here the proposition really centers around Australia having pledged a commitment. And so the violation isn't so much of the substance of the law, what the law actually is, but the notion is you said you'd do a thing and you didn't do a thing, and we understand that to be bad, and we don't need that explained to us. The third way to make meaning of this framework is by highlighting the actual values of these international laws and conventions. In general, what we find when we look at messaging research is, as I like to sometimes jokingly tell my clients, please do not take your policy out in public. It is unseemly. In general, messaging that is about policy is never as good as what the policy accomplishes. So in the U.S., for example, just to take a very different example, even a very popular policy like raising the minimum wage, which garners high marks across the board with the general public, is never going to be as popular as saying people are paid enough to provide for family. Paid sick days as a policy is never going to be as popular as you can be home to recover from illness or injury. Paid family leave is never going to be as popular as you get to see your newborn smile for the first time. So we always want to talk about what the policy accomplishes as opposed to the name of the policy. Whether or not international law as a framework is actually sort of compelling to people, I mean, other than the people on this phone call for whom that's like very stirring and very moving, my hunch is that it isn't, but happily we'll actually be testing it empirically. The other thing that I really want to hammer home, and here I'm weaving from the language analysis back into the interview analysis, one of the most interesting things that emerged out of the interviews is that there actually was very little tendency to reference country and to reference Australia. And I actually suspect that in this issue, bringing into mind for people the notion of country and sovereignty is probably not going to help us. We're going to want to keep people in the part of their brain that has them thinking of themselves and others as human beings and not so much as Australians. Because as soon as we start talking about, well, this is what Australia needs, this is what Australia wants, this is what's going on with Australia, et cetera, then instantly we have people thinking about borders. We have people thinking about sovereignty. We have people thinking about border security. Whereas when we keep them within the framework of human beings, which I'll get to in a second how we're going to do that, then those kind of top of mind things that are activated when we start talking about countries are less top of mind. The other thing is, as I'm sure you all know, almost everybody with whom we spoke during the interviews, and there were 54 of you, tended to reference desired solutions within an international framework, not just as something that Australia could manage on its own. And so again, I sort of question how useful it is to ask people to think top of mind of the notion of nation states. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Nick, I see you wanting me to show myself off, and I promise I will as soon as we get to Q&A. Really, really, really. I'll just be too distracting. I'm just so beautiful that if I have to look at myself while I'm talking, I can't. That was a joke. Nobody thinks I'm funny. There was like a little bit of issues technically here, and so I'm a little bit frazzled, and this is the way I deal with it. That's also how my hair got messy when you all see me in a moment. I was perfectly coiffed. I was like a news anchor when I walked in here. Wow, I'm killing it with this Australia crowd. They love me. So another thing that was really noteworthy in the interviews was almost no talk of rights. Contrary to the majority of the written advocacy on asylum, talk of human rights was not very common. Instead, what respondents gravitated towards was the ideas of protection, peace, equality, and above all, life. I'm going to read you some words from you all. And they're not asking for a free ride. They're asking to be treated as equals and given the chance to live a normal life. It's really fundamentally a way of preserving human life when life's at risk. When they go to bed at night, they are not kept up by the danger of people knocking on the door or coming to grab them. To be able to live a life, to be able to basically stop being persecuted and rebuild your life in a place that protects you. The purpose of asylum is a future free from harm. It's a way of enabling people to live their lives in peace and to be protected rather than put up with the violence and discrimination. When you think about it for a moment, the notion of life, protection, well-being, equality, peace, those are really, really much more central human values than the notion of rights. Rights is sort of a level away. You have the right to life. Well, then you just have life, right? You have the right to peace. Well, then you just have peace. Does that make sense? We're introducing a level of sort of technical jargon and legal complexity that gets us away from the basic shared humanity, which I'm going to argue is probably our messaging project here. Moving away from the elimination of harm in the international law or the human rights framework, the other way that we could make a case for doing something about this issue and changing our policy and changing our procedures is from the framework of creating a good. And in general, what we find is that the best way to make a case for creating a good is by attaching on to what people believe to be, whether true or false, kind of doesn't matter, the mythology of the place that they live. And so this is the notion of playing up Australian tropes without necessarily referencing the notion of Australia as a country for the reasons I said before. So some of the ideas that we're going to be playing around with in the message testing is the notion of the battler, one who struggles continually and persistently against heavy odds, and linking that idea, that national mythology, to what we see in people seeking asylum. The notion that we're not all born in the lucky country, some of us must make our own luck. Australia is a pioneer society. Australia is a place deliberately eschewing hierarchical and authoritarian old world ideas of class and rank, where what you do, not your surname, proves who you are. Australians is courageous. And specifically weaving back into something that came up a lot in the interviews, the lack of political courage that we're seeing in this and how frustrated and exhausted people are by what's become sort of a bunch of a political clown car with people just fighting and people really hungry, the general public hungry to not have to be listening to this tired, terrible debate, and messages that really are about politicians showing perhaps 1 ounce of the courage of the people seeking asylum. Finally, Australians as outcasts who found a new home by casting others out, and this notion of never again. Obviously, this wouldn't atone for previous treatment of Aboriginals, but it could demonstrate some growth and learning. And then finally, a framework we're going to be experimenting with is the potential of Australia here to really be a light onto nations and be a global leader, where we see Europeans really mucking this up. Americans, certainly, we've done our part to muck this up as well. This being an opportunity to actually get out ahead and prove leadership on a thing that's really, really important for the world. I talked before about wanting to perhaps back away from the nationalistic ideas and the notion of kind of sovereignty. We're going to be testing both messages that do that and do play into Australian tropes by marking them as Australian, and deliberately don't mark them as Australian, and we'll see what's working better. Another thing I really want to signal is a point that you seem to be belaboring a lot in the written advocacy, which is this idea, this tension between the push and the pull, and this desire to battle against what your opposition is saying, that Australia is some sort of draw. Now, in order for those arguments about authentically Australian ideas and not so authentically Australian myths that we perceive to be ideas, here, we would have to actually admit that Australia is a draw. We would have to actually admit that people are intentionally coming here. Now, when you say things like, and you do, people are not coming here for a better life. People are not just coming here for economic reasons. People are not coming here to make their lives better. That is problematic in so many ways. It's sort of hard to list the number of ways this is problematic. Let me try to begin. The first is, as you see on your slide here, there kind of isn't an ad campaign in history for anything that is not about a better life. And if we were in the same room together, I would ask you for a show of hands, who there is not trying to make a better life for themselves? And I'm going to venture a guess that none of you are raising your hand. It is a basic human instinct to want a better life for yourself. So when we say asylum seekers are not seeking a better life, what we're essentially transmitting to our audiences is that they're actually not just like you and me. They're some sort of weird other class of people, because that's something that we can't attach to. The other thing that we're doing is we're setting, I'm sorry to say, a pretty paternalistic bar and saying it's okay for certain people to come if they're fleeing, if it's a life and death situation, but if they're here because they want a better life, then we're going to cut it off there. That's the province of white people from America like me who can come here for a better life, and that's okay. I get to make the pass. But other people are only allowed to because it's a life and death situation. What we're doing here is we're actually separate. First of all, I don't believe it's true. I really don't believe it's true, because I believe that human beings fundamentally are seeking a better life for themselves and their families. And so when we characterize human beings as not doing that, it's very, very strange, and it's hard to understand who they are and what they're about. And the second thing is it does create this sort of caste system wherein certain people are allowed to have certain motivations as long as they're about kind of existential concerns, and other people are allowed to seek and want other things. And I just don't think that's right. And I actually don't think that's accurate to what you mean. And it's certainly not indicative to what you are all saying in the interviews. Speaking of this empathy building project, I'm going to give you guys a little pop quiz. So if I were to describe a friend of mine in one of three ways, I would say, you're going to tell me which way is okay to say. Is it okay to say, A, Tom is a disabled, B, Tom is a disabled person, or C, Tom is a person with a disability? Which is the correct thing to say? All of you are on mute. C. Good job, Amy. Good job. And if I were to say, my friend Linda is a gay, A, or B, a lesbian woman, which is the correct thing to say? Yes, B. And do we say that someone is a transgender? No, right? We say a trans woman or a trans man. So I would like to ask you, why is it that you are calling people asylum seekers? When you call people asylum seekers and you name you create an entire character around an action a person takes, what you're doing is you're actually creating separation between them and your potential persuadable audience, because the vast majority of Australians, and certainly the ones that are not already on board with you, are not asylum seekers, and they will, thank goodness, never be in a situation where this is something that they experience. So when we say asylum seeker, each time we say asylum seeker, what we're actually doing is we're characterizing people by what differentiates them from us instead of what anchors them to us and creates a common shared humanity. And that is why we learned 35 years ago that we don't say a disabled, we say a person with a disability. In the same vein, and again, we're going to test it, and we're going to be able to test it in really, really specific ways that are going to allow us to quantify the difference between the exact same sentence with an asylum seeker and the exact same sentence with people seeking asylum. I actually believe, given the centrality of the notion of safety that came out in the interviews, we're also going to experiment with the notion of people seeking safety. Because while most of us have never had the experience of seeking asylum, almost all of us have had, even in sort of non-truly threatening ways, felt unsafe, even if it was just being startled by someone approaching us unexpectedly. And so the notion of seeking safety is something that's, pretty common and pretty widely understood. It's also that the notion of a person seeking safety makes it very difficult to bring top of mind the notion of causing harm or being some sort of national security threat. If a person is coming here seeking safety, then it really doesn't follow, it doesn't fit into the frame that they're here to do harm. That's not what a person seeking safety is doing. Next thing I want to tackle with you, and this really goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about this tendency to say asylum seekers aren't coming here looking for a better life, is this larger tendency to fall into negating frames. Now, this picture of an elephant, for those who aren't familiar with this, comes from sort of a well-known thing in cognition that when we say to you, somebody says to you, don't think of an elephant, of course, instantly what happens is you think of an elephant because when you negate a frame, you fight a frame. When you negate a frame, you evoke a frame. And in fact, another way of thinking about it is what you fight, you feed. So anything that you actually are bringing up in order to negate it actually causes people to bring it to mind. So here are some examples of you doing just that. The government's policy of detaining unauthorized asylum seekers is not evidence of criminality. There is no such thing as a genuine or non-genuine refugee. There is nothing wrong in doing whatever you can to secure freedom. There is nothing illegal about seeking asylum. No human being is illegal. It is not a crime to enter Australia without authorization. There is no need to fear their arrival. Asylum seekers do not break any Australian laws. It's time we recognize this is a global issue and not an Australian national security threat or invasion of this country. It is improbable that a criminal or terrorist would choose such a dangerous and difficult method to enter Australia. These are not soft policies, but responses built on basic standards of human decency. So here you go. You have just called to mind and created a mental linkage between asylum seekers and what? Illegal, crime, national security threat, invasion, terrorist, right? So you have helped bring that to mind for people. I want to underscore that this notion of what you fight, you feed is equally true in your common tendency to do myth busting. The only myth busting worth conducting is that myth busting as a rhetorical technique works, because it doesn't, and it's been proven not to. Just by way of illustration, I have rewritten for you every one of those phrases into the affirmative. Here we go. The government's policy of seizing and incarcerating people fleeing unsafe conditions is absolutely evidence of criminality, that of our government. People who genuinely fear for their lives or liberty have the right to seek refuge in Australia. The instinct to survive, hunger for freedom, and ensure the safety of those you love is basic to all humans and integral to the preservation and sanctity of life. All people have rights. That's instead of no human is illegal. It is legally permissible to enter Australia without documentation in cases of danger to life or abrogation of rights. There is reason to celebrate their arrival as it marks victory for an indomitable will to live. This is instead of there is no reason to fear their arrival. People seeking asylum are acting out their legal rights by arriving on boats without previous documentation. This is instead of asylum seekers do not break any Australian law. It is time we recognize that the presence of people who must abandon all they know and love to save their very lives is a global issue that Australia has the great fortune to be able to help solve. This is instead of, it's time we recognize this is a global issue and not an Australian national security threat or invasion of this country. One kind of person would sacrifice everything and willingly pass through every gauntlet thrown to gain the right to settle in Australia. An upright person of strength and tenacity who wants only to live and live free. And then finally, instead of these are not soft policies, these are common sense approaches built on basic standards of human decency. So you see, even with just sort of a little bit of work, anytime you feel like saying a thing is not a thing, you can actually say what it is. Your opposition gets plenty of airtime, too much, I think we would all argue. We don't need to be giving them any more of it by negating their ideas. So what's happening next? As I alluded at the beginning, we are going into testing. The first thing that happens with testing, as some of you may know, is a series of 10 focus groups. Actually, we're kicking them off with 2 here in Sydney in the CBD on Monday. We then move to 2 in Melbourne on Thursday. Then we have a couple in Brisbane. And we have a couple in sort of the outskirts of Sydney. Here I'm going to demonstrate my geographic ignorance of your country. I don't know, you call things outskirts. We're having 2 in the outskirts of Melbourne and then 2 in the outskirts of Brisbane. Did I get to more than 10? I must have. It's 4 Brisbane or just outside of Brisbane, 4 Sydney or just outside of Sydney, and then 2 Melbourne. And so what happens in these focus groups, in addition to digging into people's perceptions and asking them questions, for example, about what moral principles or values they live their own lives by so that we can then anchor new messages into those principles, we are actually having them listen to a series of our messages. We've written 3 opposition messages and 10 pro messages, which includes 1 status quo message, meaning a message as you guys currently use it, because we need to see how that fares against the new messaging. And then, Nick is saying a focus group in North Queensland. Yeah, I whatever. I just go where I'm told. I just go where the airplane takes me. I get off and then I go where they tell me. Nick can tell you where they actually are. So we're seeing their responses to these messages. And the purpose of these messages is really to engage our base. So to find words that not only are okay with the base, but the base is actually excited about and desires to repeat, and that that persuades the middle and actually alienates the opposition. For those of you who will be attending groups, I don't remember where our opposition group is, but I'm going to warn everybody watching that one is going to be a shit show, because the purpose of the opposition group is really to see how far we can make them nuts. And so we are actually recruiting people who are completely and totally opposed to our position. So whoever is watching that one, that's going to be like no focus group you've ever seen before. But the others are going to be more similar in that we're going to be looking for messages that actually the base is excited about and is changing the minds of the people in the middle. And with that, we move from focus groups into the quantitative portion of our testing, which you'll hear much, much more. Jared is offering to make the popcorn. That's perfect. Yeah, that should be something to watch. So with that, I'm going to turn on my camera, as Nick requested. You guys are going to just be so impressed by how messy I look, because I didn't anticipate a camera. And we'll go to questions. Yeah?
How do you want us to indicate?
Sorry, what did you say?
How do you want us to indicate?
Oh, it's a good question. I feel like unless it gets really rowdy, sorry, I'm putting in earphones. Unless it gets really rowdy, I feel like you get the first question. Go ahead.
Okay. First, can I say, look, I've found this quite fascinating, and I've been wondering for a while why no one had attempted to do this. My observation from looking at the list of names of participants, a concern I would raise is that I don't see a lot of activist names up on the list. I think what concerns me is we need to go back to the fact that a lot of the people that are out there with messaging, including messaging into the media space, if they're not on board with this project, then a good portion of the project fails, because those people who are important public voices in opposition to this campaign are not represented in this forum.
That's a great question, and I appreciate you asking it. Sorry, I'm trying to make my camera work, I swear.
Look, and this includes people that are running some of the major Facebook pages. And I'll just put it out there really frankly and bluntly. If you haven't got people like Ian Rinchell, Chris Breen, Ian Law, etc., engaged in this process, I think it is incredibly problematic. Shane Bazzi would be another one, talking to Shane on Facebook while this is going on. I just think it's really important that one of the things that's also engaged with here is taking a step back and ensuring that the individuals who are in fact leading public voices in this campaign are in some way involved with and connected with and have some buy-in to this project, or because, with all due respect to the people who are here, I don't know who these people are except for Jared and one or two others.
Can I actually respond to that, actually? It's an incredible point, and I'm glad you brought it up. This is my part of the answer, and then I think I'll let ASRC take the rest of the answer. But one of the things that I was remiss, very, very remiss, in not mentioning about the dial testing, and this is certainly, like I said, not a complete answer, is that this methodology is rooted in the idea that if your words don't spread, your words don't work. That's sort of my pithy, how I would express what you were saying, and that the greatest dial-tested message that, you know, works with the base and persuadables that no one wants to use is sort of like that tree falling in the forest that we're not sure makes a sound. And so one of the things that we do is that in addition to the representative sample from the general public taking the dial test, which for those of you who don't know, is just an online survey methodology that allows us to gauge people's moment-to-moment responses to messages so we can actually see how they feel about every word as it's going by. And so we can get a really nuanced and subtle understanding of, oh, this message would have been good, but, you know, it started out with a part that, you know, people didn't like, and if we had begun this, if we'd taken this sentence from this message, et cetera. So what we do is we create what I call a convenient sample of advocates, and certainly everybody that we interviewed, the 54 folks who were kind enough, all of whom actually agreed to do the dial. It just takes 12 to 15 minutes, and you do it from the comfort of your own computer. We are going to have hopefully at least 100 people dial testing, and what we do is anything in a message that dial tests well with the general public but that the advocates don't like, we take it out. And I can give you a very concrete example. So in the United States, when we did a very similar process for immigration messaging, we had messages that we tested, not necessarily because I agreed with them, but in the vein of let's test it, let's get this message. We had a very, very patriotic message that roughly was about America's the best country on earth, which again, I'm not saying I agree with. America's the best country on earth, and we know that because immigrants come here, and immigrants wanting to come here is the sign that we're so awesome. That went really well with the general public. The advocates, as you will not be surprised to hear, were not keen on that message. And so we took it out. We didn't use it. And so at a quantitative level, actually, we're able to see, and it's one of the most interesting things, usually when we're presenting to advocates, is to see how you all in aggregate respond to messages. So that is certainly something that I am very, very attuned to, and I hope that ASRC will attest is something that I've been promoting and pushing on, and they've been incredibly eager and open to. But I'll let one of them take the rest of the question if there's more to say.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anat. Can people hear me okay? This is Serena from the ASRC. Great. And thanks, Victoria, for that inquiry. Just to build on what Anat has said, certainly, I think that, it's great that there are 20 advocates and activists on the call today. 150 people were invited to join. Obviously, it's difficult for people to find the time. People are really busy, so that's why we've committed to sending out a recording of today with Anat's reports to date in full, so that it goes much broader than the 20 people on the call today. We've also had over 50 people interviewed by Anat, and we have our email list that we're connecting with constantly with over 150 people across the sector, across the country on that list. We're certainly, we've got a great relationship with Ian Rintal and others, and they're connected to the project, and though people couldn't make it today, we'll absolutely be following up with the information as available. And Anat has been extraordinary in with her commitment to ensure that we're trying to reach and engage with and hear from as many activists on the ground as possible, and we'll keep trying to do that.
And if there's anyone else who you think should be on that list of advocates, like I know Shane wasn't on that list. That was just purely an omission, I think. I uploaded that list the other day just from a spreadsheet we had. So if there's people you think are missing, please feel free to flick them through to Mary, and I'll add them onto that list so everyone's getting that information direct from us.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Absolutely. We've tried and done our best to spread the word. Over the last few months, we've been talking about this project for 6 months before it's gotten underway, but if there's people that we've missed, please let us know and we can absolutely connect with them and, share the materials yourselves as well. We certainly don't want people to not be involved.
Holly is asking, have any politicians been involved? There were people who, there were a couple of politicians interviewed, and actually, I have been approached by a couple of folks in the Green Party, a couple of folks in the Labour Party. I don't know whether for good or for ill, am a recent enough arrival myself and ignorant enough of the ins and outs of your various parties that I'm basically like, oh, you do this? You're interested in it? Great. I'm trying not to pay attention to the dysfunctional family side of it.
And it's Serena again. Yes, there is, Victoria, people from Labour for Refugees are definitely in the loop. And Holly, we've got, as Anat said, both the Greens and Labour, we're just keeping abreast of it, and people who have expressed interest have certainly, we're sharing information with them, because certainly we want those people on the big national platforms to be running with the messaging that we think is the way to go. We also, in the lead up to Labour National Conference, tried to work hard on shifting their policy platform, but also a key part of our communication with them was letting them know about this project. And Anat presented at that conference here in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago. So, yeah, we are trying to engage with politicians as well.
G'day all, this is Jared McKenna. Firstly, thanks Serena and Con for getting Anat and making this possible and being so generous with it as well. This is really, really fantastic. Another line of questioning in terms of who's involved. For those who have sought safety here or in the process of seeking safety, is there any way to actually involve them in giving feedback around the messaging?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. That's an excellent question, and yeah, something that both us at the ASRC and Anat, in fact, Anat was so dedicated to this, didn't want to run with the research without those voices included. We have tried to engage. I don't see the final interview list about who, if there were people seeking asylum on the last interview list. I think Anat might be able to speak to that, but we certainly have tried to. I think for us, so that's probably a bit of a gap in terms of there's not a high number. Victoria, we certainly tried to engage RISE. I'm not sure if they were on the final interview list, but we certainly made attempts, and we do work closely with them through our legal program and other services. So, certainly try to organise advocate interviews with them and are keeping them in the loop because they're on the list. And we'll continue to follow up. But I think it's probably somewhere, though, that is we could be doing better, and certainly happy to take sort of advice and support on that as well.
I can tell you, knowing the interviewee list intimately, and I should tell you, in case it's not obvious, all the interviewees were promised complete anonymity, and so if it seems like I'm, being cagey or not naming names, I'm not naming names because I said I wouldn't. But among the 54 with whom we spoke, like I said, I made a hard push for the folks to actually have the lived experience themselves. And I think we ended up with 8 people of that 54 that fall into that category. And then a little bit more for whom that was a familial experience in terms of extended family, but not necessarily their personal lived experience. So between that, we were sort of up to 12. When we get to the dial testing, because it's a relatively easy ask, I mean, easy in the sense if you have an internet connection, which I realize might not be ubiquitous, that's something I want us to push really, really, really hard on. And I think we would love all of your help, because we do, like I said, if your words don't spread, they don't work. And we are not in the business of creating messages that somehow would work if people would only use them, but people don't want to use them.
Thanks, Anna.
Any other questions?
Hello? Hello?
Hi.
We can hear you.
Hi, sorry. It's a queer here from MBA in Queensland. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. I joined in a little bit late, so you may have already covered this, and I must have missed it. But in terms of the next steps and the focus group, that's what you're talking. You said was going to be happening, right?
Yeah.
Yes. I was just quite keen to know what the makeup of that focus group will be, because one of the things that I was actually trying to get happening here is around talking to your, insert whatever term you want to use, but perhaps the people who definitely are not, is like part of the converted, and the people who are actually the opposite to the advocates and the in the sector. So I'm really keen to talk about seeing if you would be talking to, if you like, your average person, but also a person who actually is against, if you like, refugees and asylum seekers seeking protection here, just to understand those mindsets if we're then hopefully going to change it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the focus groups are all general public focus groups, meaning they are people from all walks of life, but certainly not advocates. And if somehow, by some strange coincidence, somebody who happens to be working on these kinds of issues was on a focus group list, they were recruited out. So this is really meant to be, do you guys have the expression John Q. Public? It's really meant to be sort of your average Australian man and woman. And the way that the groups are structured is each group is a little bit different. So, for example, the groups that we're doing in Sydney on Monday are persuadable women under 30 and base men between 30 to 50. That just happens to be the first two groups we recruited. We have other groups that are persuadable men. We have other groups that are base women. We have other groups that are older women, younger men. We have a group that is recent arrivals, so people who are first generation Australians or have not even yet sought or, haven't yet received citizenship. And so the groups, what the common thread is of the groups is, in some cases, gender. And I can explain why the reason we gender segregate the groups, we don't do this in every issue, but we often tend to do it because I'm sure, as will shock the women on this phone call, when you have a mixed gender group, women tend to get less of a word in edgewise. And so, especially when you have white men. And so we tend to gender segregate groups because otherwise women don't get to talk that much. We also gender segregate groups in issue areas in which we see what we call a gender cleavage. And so in this issue, we do see in national surveys women tending to have better overall attitudes than men. We're also segregating by age because there's also a dynamic in which when there are younger men and older men tend to dominate the conversation. We do see some cleavages statistically in attitudes by age, and so we want to separate those groups. So what the groups are recruited for that makes them really, really interesting. Oh, looks like I need to mute my mic. I'm sorry, Nick. There. Is that better? I think so.
No, it depends on everyone else on the call. Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, okay. So what we did was we asked people basic attitudinal questions. And we asked them a host of attitudinal questions, mostly about people seeking asylum, but also about other political issues, because we don't want them to know what conversation they're walking into. So, for example, we asked them a question about marriage equality, about taxation, about inequality, et cetera. We also are exploring education level. Yes, we absolutely have that. We have income. We have all sorts of different factors. We have religiosity. We're collecting data on all of that. And when we get to the survey, which is the quantitative portion, we'll be able to do crosstabs on all of those different factors: geographic region, rural versus urban, male, female, religiosity, age, education level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we've also, we're segregating people in groups by education level, because that also creates a dynamic. People who tend to have higher education levels tend to dominate more in groups, and people who have lesser education levels can become intimidated in group speaking. And in focus groups, our objective is really to encourage everyone to speak. So what's interesting about the focus groups, I mean, for me, everything is interesting, but I think what's interesting for non-research nerds, if I can remember what's interesting to non-research nerds, is we're calling people based upon their basic attitudinal preferences. And so we ask questions like, to what extent do you agree, disagree? The way somebody arrives in Australia or the way somebody comes to Australia says something about who that person is. We ask questions about, no matter what somebody looks like or where they come from, they could become Australian. If people fundamentally disagree with those things, those people are opposition. They are people who we will never convince, because honestly, they're just demonstrating, pretty kind of prototypically xenophobic and racist attitudes. Whereas people who are sort of mixed minds on foundational questions like that, we consider to be more of our persuadable audience, and that's mostly who we're talking to. So I hope that answers the question. But not advocates. Regular Australians. I think we probably have time for one more question. I guess I scared you off by implying you're not regular.
I've got one typing at the moment from Jared.
Okay. Being not regular is a compliment. I hope everybody knows.
Thanks, Jared. So, Anat, if no one has any other questions, thank you all so much for taking the time to dial in. And as we said, you'll hear from either myself and Mary and Nick in terms of sending information around and disseminating this today recording, all going well with technology. Fingers crossed on that, and the reports as well, and then ongoing updates on the focus groups. And some of you have responded that you'll be able to attend the focus group, so we did put that invite out as well. So
yeah, so I will get to meet some of you in person very soon. And those of you in, how is it pronounced, Parramatta?
Parramatta. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
those of you there, do not judge. Do not judge. That group will not go. That group not going well is that group going well. So those watching that need to look at it with a different lens.
Thanks so much, Anat.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.